We just returned from a several-week-long camping trip through Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and Alaska. Not Alaska, I wish it was Alaska, I mean Oregon. This trip did not go as planned.
And this trip was actually much longer than our normal short weekender trip.
Now let's go over the top 10 lessons that we learned that you'll want to use for your next trip. You have found Explorer Trek Adventure with Kelly and Greg. We cover everything camping from backpacking to adventure vans. Let's talk about poop. You know, everybody does it, nobody wants to talk about it. We actually have a cassette toilet, but we don't actually poop in it. This is our toilet, and we only do number 1 in it, and that includes paper does not go in it. It goes into a side bag. And we do this because dumping this cassette, when there's a bunch of solids in it, can be pretty disgusting. So what do? You poop in a bucket. And that consists of a bucket, a liner, and a special bucket toilet seat. And if you want to get fancy, a pad that absorbs the liquid. The most convenient thing about the bucket, it can go anywhere. I actually like to just put it back in the back. Greg, he actually likes to take it outside often. And when you're all done, you just take it out, wrap it up, and inside here we actually keep our supplies for next time. And you absolutely, when you're all done, have to reset it for the next time. We bring it into the back, to our bag, where we keep a big, large black bag inside of here and put it inside. So that way it's not inside the van.
Now, when it comes to clothing, it's not a very glamorous topic, but it's an important one. We both honestly had no idea what we were gonna pack. We each ended up with one of these, which doesn't seem like a lot. You can surprisingly fit quite a bit of stuff in here if you roll it up and be a little bit strategic. Keep in mind, this is primarily just our warm weather clothes. We actually both have a pillow, and this has all of our cold weather gear, some of our jackets, some of our sweatpants, stuff like that. It was pretty amazing to think that I wasn't gonna have enough clothes, and I ended up maybe using a third of the items in here. Keep in mind, you can always do laundry. On shorter trips, you're not gonna do laundry, but on long trips, you can, whether it be at a laundromat or just at the van at a creekside. A big eye-opener for this trip was internet service and how important it ended up being. I know the trolls will be like, oh, you have internet, you're not out roughing it. Well, this time it was super, super important. Why? Because like all of Idaho was on fire. In the Pacific Northwest, even when you're out in the wild, oftentimes, very surprisingly, you will actually have cell service. Well, when we were in Montana and Idaho, that is not the case. We actually relied, I think, about 95% of the time. Maybe there was one time where we actually had cell service, but every other time we had to use Starlink. There ended up being 3 things that we used internet for, and honestly, those were a requirement for this trip and not optional. First thing is to let people know where we were. Oftentimes we were just out in the middle of nowhere, and we oftentimes saw nobody. The second item was the wildfires, and when I say all of Idaho is on fire, obviously it's not, but a huge section was, and it was actually very close to us. At one point, I think we were camped about 25-30 miles away. Every morning and evening, we'd get online and actually check the statuses of the fires. There was actually several times where the road closed completely, and we had to reroute. Which brings us to number 3, is changing the route and actually figuring out where you're going to go next. And on a happier note, you can always watch movies and YouTube on this. I figured out if you watch YouTube at 160p, it looks like a hot mess, but you can watch hours and hours of it.
Now for water, not only drinking water, but also fresh water to fill up the van. And that can be a little tricky, at least it was for us, planning it and also finding it. We primarily used this for our drinking water, which wasn't too bad finding jugs to be able to fill it up with, you know, just stop at the grocery store. But now finding water to fill up the van, like with a hose, that was a little bit harder to do. For those short weekend trips, you just fill up before you leave, and you don't even have to worry about it. We ended up using iOverlander for our longer trip. Just remember when you're using these apps like iOverlander that it might not have the most current information. We actually had a few misses. It said it had water, it did not. So remember to have 2 or 3 extra backups just in case. And of course, don't forget to ask, talk to people. We actually had a few people tell us where we could find water. One guy even said we could come to his house and fill up.
Next up is waste, and we found that I think that waste may actually be harder than water in some cases. This is what we ended up doing with garbage. We used to have a bigger garbage bag that we would put here. Well, it turns out if you have a big giant garbage bag, there's limited places you can dump that. But if you have a nice tiny small little garbage bag like this, there's a lot of places you can dump it. We found the 4-gallon bags are actually kind of the perfect size. And we've also discovered that when you put your garbage bag on here, We normally keep it on the other side. It creates a perfect platform for an iPad. Another thing you can do is separate your waste, and you put paper garbage in one spot and then other garbage in another. You can then burn that paper waste and you're left with a lot less waste to have to dispose of. We couldn't do that for this trip because of the fire dangers, but it's an option. Second part of the waste problem goes with your wastewater from the actual gray tank, because you have to find places to dump it. We also used iOverlander for this. This is just as problematic as the other one, plus it can be quite expensive. Some places charged up to $20. Just like freshwater, have multiple options for dumping. Next up is reservations versus just winging it. And we actually found out that reservations is sometimes nice to have, but in the area we were in, we could definitely wing it. Reservations actually sound really good when you're thinking about it, and they can be, but they also can be a hindrance. We had a couple reservations at the start where we definitely needed them. But then we had this lingering one towards the end, and we actually had to manipulate our trip so we would end up at that point at that night. This is gonna be very dependent on the location. If you're like several hours within a major metropolis area, that can be rough. In Idaho and Montana, where it's very sparse, you can really go without reservations. So I think if we had to do this over again, we would cut off all the reservations at the end and we would have just kind of figured our way through. We found a huge difference between the weekends and weekdays, which it was actually like night and day difference. On the weekends, we would see people. On weekdays, we had places to ourselves, which was really awesome. We found it was much easier to go without reservations than we originally thought. We'd get into a new area. We'd often pass a sign that says campground over here that we didn't even see on the map. Don't be afraid to wing it.
This might surprise you, but I try to pack enough food for the entire trip at the very start, which is a little bit silly since there's grocery stores. Yes, plan out your food for your trip, but do it in smaller sections or by location. Just don't do it for the whole trip. Showers and keeping clean. We had two methods. One was getting baby wipes. We actually used this like shower one, wipe down your body. And when we got really dirty, it was time to take a shower, which we used our sponge method. This actually saves quite a bit of water since we had to conserve. This is the shower system by Geyser. Instead of using a handheld squirter, which uses a lot of water, this is actually a sponge. We like it so far, but we're still doing some testing. Two things that I learned that made this trip so much easier was my teapot, because I love to have my tea in the morning, and of course Greg likes his instant coffee. And of course, the microwave. It made heating up leftovers and making a quick snack when you didn't want to cook so much better.
My two are pretty easy, as it's both on the back. It's this big storage box. It basically kept all that junk out of the back of the van. There's a lot of dirty stuff in here. My second item is this big storage bag we have on the back spare tire. Over on these side pockets, you can see I've got a lock on here because I keep fuel canisters, and that way we have no fuel canisters on the inside. And if we open it up, this is where we carry our garbage, but you can see how ginormous this thing is. It's also big enough for firewood. It's just big enough for anything dirty that you just want to chuck in here and don't have it inside the van. Last up, what changes would we make for our future trips? And for me, I think the big thing would be, instead of just finding random places to camp, I want to find random places to go adventuring and then find campsites next to those places.
And for me, it would be a vacuum because it was a hot mess in there. A broom can only get so much, so that is definitely top of our list. Hopefully some of these lessons we learned will help you on your next trip.
You can find us at exploretrekadventure.com.
Go watch this video next, and we'll see you next time.